That morning, standing at the courtroom door, the weight of his green uniform felt heavier than it ever had. Sergeant Marcus Webb, 29 years old, wore the stripes that told of 11 years of service. From the dusty streets of Baghdad to the quiet corridors of Fort Hood, the honor he had carried now waited for him to take a seat. The presiding officer had not yet entered. In the room, there was only the sound of wind against the window and the rhythm of his own breath. The brown leather folder in his right hand trembled slightly with the documents inside. No one had told him he would be here this morning. But looking back, it all began with that November morning. When Webb returned to Fort Hood, the first thing he felt was relief. The second Iraq tour was over. There were no new scars on his body, only an old burn on his left wrist, a remnant from a rocket attack. Stepping onto the base, there was comfort in returning to the routine order of military police work. Mornings at 05:30, regular inspections, paperwork, procedures. Everything was in its place. No car bombs, no roadside explosives, no suspicious silhouettes. Just reports, shifts, and the dry, hot silence of Texas. The first week nothing happened, the second week too. On Thursday of the third week, during a routine patrol past Major Ronald Hayes's office, he saw something. A small detail that might have been insignificant to an ordinary person. A soldier's personal locker stood open, its contents removed, arranged, as if photographed. The soldier was not there. There was no search warrant. Only the commander's door was slightly ajar, and from inside came a satisfied voice, the sound of conversation with another officer. Webb stopped. The procedure was clear. Article 134 of the UCMJ was explicit. A soldier's personal property could only be accessed with a court order or for urgent security reasons. Hayes had neither. Webb knew this because he was military police. He knew every regulation, every procedure, every article by heart. That night, sitting in his quarters, he wrote his report. Short, precise, emotionless. Article, date, time, observation. He documented it, signed it, submitted it to the chain of command. The next morning, Hayes called him into his office. The room was small, its window facing south. Behind the desk sat Hayes, and before him Webb stood. The commander did not speak, only placed the report on the desk. The edge of the paper was slightly creased. Webb's handwriting was orderly, flawless. Hayes tapped his finger on the report twice hard. Then he pushed the file aside and fixed his eyes on Webb. He said something, but the only word that remained in Webb's mind was one: wrong. You misunderstood. You misinterpreted. Wrong place, wrong time. Webb did not answer. There was no need. The report was already the answer. Hayes nodded, closed the file, and gestured for Webb to leave. Webb saluted and left the room. But the report did not close. It reached higher command, and at that moment, the first silent war of Marcus Webb's military career had begun. No one said anything openly, but the atmosphere changed. The NCOs who saluted him in the morning corridors stood a little more distant. At lunch, conversations at the table stopped when Webb approached. On the evening shift, the duty roster changed. Webb was no longer assigned routine checks, but night watches, different buildings, different people. No one said anything, but everyone knew. For a military policeman to file a report, especially about a commander, meant crossing an invisible line. Webb had crossed that line. December passed quietly. Christmas leave came. Webb visited his family in Texas. His mother asked him something with her eyes, but did not voice it. His father was a retired Marine, 17 years of service. At dinner, he looked at Webb's face and said only one sentence: "You look good." Webb nodded, but he did not feel good. When he returned to base in January, another incident occurred. A soldier had been detained, the reason unclear. There was no arrest document, no charge, only Hayes's verbal order. Webb checked the paperwork. There was nothing, just a note. Commander's directive. Webb wrote another report, this time shorter, colder. He sent it. 2 days later, an envelope arrived in the morning mail. Official seal, Military Justice Department. When he opened the document inside, the first word was investigation. Charge, dereliction of duty. Allegation. In November, he had failed to submit a base security report on time, missed a critical detail, failed to fulfill his responsibility. Webb read it again, then a third time. Nothing was true. But the paper was official, the signatures were real, and the system had begun to work. When Webb returned to his quarters that evening, he sat on his bunk and looked at the document in his hand. Outside the sun was setting, the light slowly receding. In the room there was only himself and the paper. For a moment he thought about tearing up the document, but he did not, because he was a man who believed in procedure. The system had to work. Justice had to prevail. That night he could not sleep. In mid-February, a date was set for the court-martial hearing. Webb was assigned a lawyer, a young lieutenant named Miller. Well-meaning, but inexperienced. At their first meeting, Miller showed Webb all the documents. The November report had been filed on time. The security detail had not been missed. Everything was in the files. Miller was optimistic, saying they would win. But the feeling inside Webb, that feeling from behind cover in Baghdad, was still there. He knew something would go wrong. The first week of March, the courtroom opened, in a small building in the south wing of Fort Hood. Inside it was cold. The air conditioning was on too high. The walls were beige, the lights white neon. The presiding officer, a colonel, was a middle-aged man with a lined face. The jury, 5 officers, all experienced, all inside the system. 15 people were in the room, half military personnel, half support staff. Webb's family was not there. They were too far away. He did not want them to come. At the first hearing, the prosecutor stood, a major in his 50s, close-cropped hair, commanding voice. His statement was brief. He alleged that Sergeant Webb was unreliable, that there were inconsistencies in his reports, that he generated unnecessary complaints against command. Witnesses were called. Some spoke in Webb's favor, some remained silent, some said they did not remember. Hayes never testified, but his name appeared in every sentence, like a passive presence, invisible but everywhere. On the second day, Miller presented Webb's defense. Documents were shown, dates were read, witnesses were heard. Everything was in Webb's favor. The November report was there, the signatures were there, the timestamps were correct. But on the other side was Hayes's influence, silent but heavy. On the third day, Webb took the stand. He was sworn in, sat down, placed his hands on the table. Questions came. Webb answered. His voice was low, calm, trained. Procedures, documents, dates. He did not defend himself, just stated the facts, because there was no need for defense. The truth was already there. But sometimes the truth is not enough. The prosecutor stood, showed a document, an old report Webb had written in Iraq. In that report, too, he had complained about a commander, a minor procedural violation. Nothing had happened then, but now it was being shown. The prosecutor asked, "Do you always complain about your commanders?" Webb answered, "Only when there is a procedural violation." The prosecutor asked again, "Is procedure more important to you than orders?" Webb paused. This question was a trap. He answered, "Procedure is what protects orders." The prosecutor smiled, sat down. The jury took notes. Miller wanted to object, but the presiding officer denied it. The hearing closed, the jury withdrew. Webb waited. 2 days later, the verdict was announced. When Webb entered the room, the jury was already seated. The presiding officer stood, read the document. Sergeant Marcus Webb is acquitted of the charge of dereliction of duty, found not guilty. Webb stood. Miller breathed a sigh of relief. No family was there, but 2 soldier friends in the room nodded slightly. But the presiding officer continued. The word, however, hung in the air. The court has determined that Sergeant Webb has demonstrated reliability issues in command relationships. This notation will be entered into the personnel file. Webb's face did not change, but something inside broke. The presiding officer added, "This notation will be considered in promotion evaluations and future duty assignments." Then he struck the gavel. The hearing was over. Webb saluted, turned, left the room. Outside the sun was shining, Texas was hot, but Webb felt cold. That notation was 1 sentence, but it meant the end of a career. In military personnel files, a reliability issues notation was an invisible mark. No promotion, no special assignments, no advancement to higher ranks. Webb knew this. Miller wanted to appeal, but Webb shook his head, said no. The war was over, but it had been lost. In April, Webb returned to routine duties, but nothing was the same anymore. Shifts were changed, duties were reduced, responsibilities were taken from him. In May, an officer asked him about his future plans. Webb did not answer. In June, Webb submitted his request to separate from the military. Voluntary discharge. Not honorable discharge, but general discharge under honorable conditions, which meant not clean, but not bad either. Somewhere in the middle. It meant he could not use his military background as a reference. At the end of July, Webb walked out of Fort Hood's gates for the last time. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a white t-shirt. In his hand was a bag containing the souvenirs of 11 years, metal dog tags, a few medals, photographs. He never looked back. In August, he moved to Dallas. He rented a small apartment, one room, kitchen, bathroom. He looked for work. He sent his resume, military police experience, Iraq tour, documentation. But security companies asked for references. Webb could not provide them. In September, he found a security guard position at a shopping mall. The pay was slightly above minimum wage. His uniform was navy blue, no longer green. He had no weapon, only a radio. The shift was 12 hours, 8 in the morning to 8 at night, sometimes night shift. The job was simple. Check the stores, follow anyone suspicious, write reports. The first week felt strange. The mall lights were too bright, the music too loud. People were shopping, drinking coffee, laughing. No one was a threat. No one was an enemy. But Webb still stood alert. His body had been trained that way. In December, Christmas season arrived. The mall became crowded. Webb stood 12 hours a day, walked the corridors, monitored the cameras. He was tired, but did not complain. Work was work. The new year came, then spring, then summer. Years passed. In 2016, 7 years later, one morning he saw a small news item in the local paper. At Fort Hood, a commander was being investigated for illegal search and detention operations. Name, Major Ronald Hayes, now retired. Allegation: he had violated the rights of at least 12 soldiers, conducted searches without warrants, produced false reports. The Military Justice Department had opened an investigation. Some victims had testified. Among the evidence were old reports Webb had written in 2009, but Webb's name was not mentioned, only document numbers, dates. Hayes could not be promoted. He retired, with full retirement pay. His career was complete. Webb folded the newspaper, finished his coffee, went to his shift. No one thanked him. No one mentioned his name. The system cleaned itself, just as it always did. That night after his shift, Webb sat in his car. The engine was running, but he was not moving. On the dashboard sat his old metal dog tags: Webb, Marcus A. Blood Type O positive. Religion none. He had worn them around his neck for 11 years, in Baghdad, in Fallujah, at Fort Hood. Now they sat on a plastic panel. Cold, silent, meaningless. Webb looked at them. And he accepted a truth. Doing the right thing does not always bring victory. Sometimes it only brings silence. Sometimes only loneliness. Sometimes the only thing you get is the right to look in the mirror. And some days that is enough, some days it is not. Webb went home that night. His apartment was small, 2 rooms. On the wall was a photograph, Baghdad, 2007, with his team. In those days he was young, hopeful, an honorable soldier. Now he was still honorable, but he was no longer a soldier. He turned off the light, lay down on the bed. Outside were the sounds of Dallas at night, cars, people, life. But in his room there was only silence, and Webb listened to that silence, because that silence was the sound of his choice. He had told the truth, paid the price. The system had excluded him, but his conscience was clear. And perhaps some wars are won this way. Invisible, silent, alone, truth demands a price. And Marcus Webb had paid it.